Okay, so I'm going to go completely off script with this video. I've spent probably close to a week trying to research, trying to find some useful clips that I could use to share to illustrate the points that I wanted to talk about in this video. Um, but it seems like the clips that are out there don't quite hit on what I'm trying to talk about. So I'm kind of just going to wing it. You're mostly going to be listening to me conveying information back as opposed to providing you with wonderfully insightful clips that I've managed to find. That said, for anyone who is interested in learning more about trauma, about PTSD, about complex PTSD, um, I highly recommend the published works of Bruce Perry. He's like the expert when it comes to childhood trauma, um, something he's been doing for an eternity. One book that is pretty much recommended as the Bible when it comes to looking at childhood trauma is his book, which is called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I believe there is a more recent book that was done in collaboration with Oprah Winfrey, of all people, that is called What Happened to You? And that's had some pretty good reviews. I haven't looked at it, so I can't recommend it or not recommend it, but certainly Bruce Perry, if you really want to learn more about trauma and the impacts, etc., that's who you're looking for. I have noticed that there are a number of lengthy videos on YouTube which are Bruce Perry talking about trauma and stuff. I haven't actually watched any of them yet, but you can guarantee if you put in a search, if you find a video that's Bruce Perry talking at a seminar or something, watch it because he's pretty much everything. His work is pretty much what so many psychiatrists and psychologists base their trauma practices on these days. Now, there's a few, I guess you could say, topics that I want to address in this video, which relate both to Maddie's case and Jack and Lily's case. And while I will be coming at it from several different angles, at the base of the matter is the issue of trauma attachment and its impact. Now, there's a lot of materials out there that cover trauma attachment and coercive control, but that's only a little part of what I want to talk about in this video. So, given how easy it is to research that, to find more materials on that, I haven't included any clips that relate directly to trauma attachment and coercive control. But like I said, I will be touching on that, but sort of from a different angle. Now, before I jump in, this is not normally something that I do actually bring up in my videos or my live streams. Um, but I do have a Buy Me a Coffee account, which is linked in the description section for the video. Normally, I just leave it there and let people discover it. If they find it, they find it. The reason I'm bringing it up is because for some reason, anytime I cover any content that relates to Madeline Soto, 9 times out of 10, my videos get demonetized by YouTube. And the topic that I'm covering today is also the sort of topic that's likely to get demonetized by YouTube. So, in terms of this video, there is a pretty high chance that there's going to be no income coming in for me for this. And while I'm not here to make money, to make a profit out of these cases, I do put in long hours, and the cost of running a YouTube channel is actually surprisingly not so cheap. By the time you pay subscriptions for your StreamYard, your audio editing, your video editing, so many other little bits and pieces here and there. I mean, I'm easily paying probably, I originally said a few weeks ago that's probably cost me about $100 a month in subscriptions. but I would probably bump that up closer to 150. And that's before other expenses, your internet costs and stuff like that. When you're doing uploads on a daily basis, your data costs tend to shoot up pretty damn quick. So while I don't normally highlight the fact that I do have a Buy Me a Coffee account, I did want to just bring it up this one time because support in those ways does help me to continue with my channel, to be able to afford to continue with my channel. Now, given that I'm addressing two different cases here, I'm just going to give you a rundown of each case. I know there's a lot of people who followed both these cases. I know there are people who followed me when I covered Maddie's case and continue to follow me with Lily and Jack's case. And I also know that there's people who've joined me for Lily and Jack's case and have been following me with my Maddie Mondays, where I've been discussing Maddie's case again. I'm just trying to put the spotlight on Jenn Soto, just trying to get Maddie's story out there again. So, for a quick rundown, I'll start with Madeline Soto. Maddie turned 13 on the 22nd of February 2024. 13 is a wonderful time. So exciting. You start to feel like you're growing up. You start to feel like you're a real teenager. I can remember how excited I was to turn 13. Now, Maddie's mum started a new job. Her mother, Jennifer Soto, started a new job just before Maddie's 13th birthday. And she was going through training for that new job. So on the Sunday night after Maddie's birthday, this was the 25th of February, Maddie's grandmother threw a birthday party for Maddie. It was for family and a handful of Maddie's closest friends. But Jenn didn't attend because she had to go to work. So Maddie had this beautiful birthday party, and the picture you can see here is her in her beautiful birthday dress that was taken at her party. Um, chance for a little 13-year-old to dress up and feel a little bit grown up. Now, after her birthday party, Jenn was still working, so Maddie's aunt dropped her back home, and the arrangement was that Maddie would get herself organised, get herself ready for bed, and Jenn was due to arrive home about 10:30, 11 o'clock. Now, Jenn used to have a live-in boyfriend, Sterns. Won't bother giving him his full name, but he'd moved out back in December, moved back down to Northport, where his family lived. All this happened in Kissimmee, Florida, so a few hours away from where Stephan's parents lived. But Jenn had arranged for Stephan to come and stay for a week. I suspect that it was mainly to celebrate Jen's birthday, which was coming up on the 3rd of March. So Stephan arrived at the townhouse shortly after Maddie was dropped off home by her aunt. And he was there with Maddie for a few hours before Jenn finally came home from work. Now, the layout of the townhouse is that there is a master bedroom downstairs, and upstairs there's 3 bedrooms. They had 2 live-in housemates who had 2 of the upstairs bedrooms, and then the other upstairs bedroom was kept as a guest room. Maddie didn't actually have her own bedroom. There was a little annex, if you can even call it that, off the corner of the living room, where she had her bed and one of those screens, one of those room dividers, which separated that from the open living area where you had the living room and the kitchen. But for the most part, Maddie slept in her mother's bed, even though she was at that point 13. The arrangement was, however, that Stephan Sterns also slept in Jen's bed with Maddie and Jenn. So that evening, after Maddie's birthday party, Jenn arrived home. She decided she was really tired. She needed a good night's sleep. So she actually sent her 13-year-old daughter upstairs to sleep in the guest room with 37-year-old Stephan Sterns. That was the last anyone saw Maddie alive. They reported her missing the following day, claiming that Stephan had dropped her off at school the following morning because Jenn needed a sleep in. And then after that, they don't know what happened. As it turned out, Stephan had strangled Maddie that night or in the early hours of the morning and had disposed of her remains some distance away from the townhouse. He also had thousands of images and videos on his phone, which evidenced about 5 years of trauma for Maddie with this guy. Now, he's serving 21 life sentences. He's not going anywhere. But it cost Maddie. Maddie's not around anymore. Barely 13, she's gone. Jack and Lily, I'm sure that most of you know Jack and Lily's case. I would imagine that many of the people watching right now usually watch because I cover Jack and Lily's case. Anyone who is not aware, Jack and Lily went missing on the 2nd of May 2025. We don't really know much more than that, other than a lot of crazy stories from both sides. We know they weren't abducted. That has been ruled out completely by the RCMP. We know that they didn't wander off into the woods. We also know that the 3 people who were on the property when Lily and Jack went missing wouldn't know truth if it bit them in the ass. So we wait. We wait for, hopefully, Lily and Jack to be found, and we wait for justice for Lily and Jack. So that's what brings me to this video today. Now, I want to start with a quick discussion of PTSD as opposed to CPTSD, because I know I bring it up a lot in my videos, and it occurred to me, I think after the last Maddie live stream, that I've never really explained it. I've just presumed that everyone knew exactly what each of those are. So just a quick recap for people. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This usually stems from a single event, something that's traumatic, a traumatic event. So you might be in a car accident and that might lead to flashbacks, a trauma reaction that relate to that event happening. It's a case of this thing happened to me and now I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with panic attacks. I struggle with all the things that you associate with PTSD. CPTSD, complex PTSD, is something that comes from lengthy exposure to trauma. This is when you have neglect, where you have abuse of any sort, family dysfunction, anything that is an ongoing cause of trauma. So your regular PTSD is this thing happened to me, this has caused trauma, and I struggle with this. Complex PTSD is basically this bad thing happened to me over and over again, and it's had this effect on me. Now, when I was doing Maddie's case, I actually put out a video where I discussed the similarities between ADHD and the symptoms of CPTSD. And there's a lot of overlap, and also quite often you will find that you've got both going on, because it seems that children who are neurodivergent somehow seem to be more susceptible to abuse. But that's a topic for another day. So, a similarity that we have between both cases is that Maddie was diagnosed as having ADHD, and Malaya and Daniel keep claiming that Lily and Jack might have had ASD, autism spectrum disorder. I have no doubt whatsoever with Maddie that what she was presenting was almost certainly PTSD or complex PTSD. Maybe there was some ADHD in there as well, but there's no way known that after 5, 6 years of that kind of abuse from Stephan Sterns, that she wouldn't be suffering with CPTSD. Lily and Jack, I again believe that we could well be looking at a situation of CPTSD. And while there are some things that make me think possibly there could be some autism there, they could be on the spectrum. Lily with her little squeal when she gets excited. Jack with his fixation with bugs and worms. Jack with his tendency to throw his boot at the bus driver. But without knowing more, they could simply be just normal children just showing normal developmental behaviors. I think we've all seen that with some children who go through phases. But quite honestly, I think that just like Maddie, Lily and Jack were also struggling with CPTSD. And I think that if that's the case, that it doesn't just stem from their time living on Gairloch Road. And in fact, when it comes to Maddie, I think that her trauma issues also started long before Stearns was on the scene. So, where to go from here? I think probably the logical way to go here is to start first by talking about regular, healthy attachment patterns, the connections that are formed from pretty much day one for a child. And so the thing is, trauma can have a significant impact on the development of healthy attachment patterns in children. And this is something that's going to have a lifelong effect. Not only that, but it can make them more susceptible to additional traumas at later stages in life. So, when you're talking about the formative years for a child, their relationship with their primary caregivers is so important. They they need a emotional attunement. They need that emotional connection. They need to feel protected. They need to know that that primary caregiver is going to be looking after their basic needs. That if they're hungry, their primary caregiver is always going to make sure that they're fed. If they're crying because they're hurting or upset, that there is going to be that person there to comfort them, to give them those connections that are so desperately needed in those formative years. Even just the physical contact, regular physical contact, is crucial for development for a child. So there were studies done many, many years ago where they did scans of brains of orphans in Romania. So essentially, the communist leader of Romania between 1965 and 1989 thought that he was basically going to increase Romania's like prosperity and everything by increasing the population, and from that starting off a massive like industrial expansion. So in order to achieve that, he made a bunch of decrees, basically banning contraception, um, banning abortion, and taxing families that had fewer than 5 children. But of course, that led to all these families who could not care for that amount of children, so you ended up with a whole lot of abandoned children. Um, in 1990, after he was deposed and executed, there were more than 170,000 children living in these institutions throughout Romania. And we're talking living in squalid conditions, overcrowded, and with a really small number of caregivers for basically the number of children. So most of the children basically existed in these cots. They weren't getting physical contact. They were pretty much being left to vegetate. Anyway, so there's this well-known study that was done around these orphans that were in all these institutions. What they did is they did examinations on 180 children from one of the really large institutions, all children under 3, and they came up with 136 that met criteria for inclusion in their study. And then of those children, they assigned a number of children to foster care, while other children were put in continued care, but obviously with funding so that it wasn't like the squalid conditions that they had begun life in. The children that were placed in foster care were given considerable amounts of support. They were financed. Um, the parents were licensed by the government, so it wasn't just throwing them into random homes. They were given a monthly salary. They had social workers visit the families every 10 days, and they also met weekly with psychologists via like phone, Skype, or in person. And everything they needed was supplied. So toys, diapers, pediatrician on call 24 hours a day. And what the outcome was that with very few exceptions, the children who had been placed in foster care showed vast improvements over the children who had been left in institutions. So there were improvements in their IQ, improvements in language, in attachment security, and in peer relationships. Now, obviously, for the purpose of this video, what is significant here is improvements in attachment security. But they also, compared to the children who were left in institutions, showed much better physical development, and that includes what you can see here, which basically shows the difference in the brain scans between the children who were placed in foster care and a child who was left in that institutionalized environment. Now, I have seen coloured scans of these, but I couldn't find them at doing a quick Google search. But essentially, it's not just the size, but in the brain activity as well. So the scans show different levels of brain activity. But I think this is a really good illustration of how, in like early relationships, if a child's relationships are inconsistent, neglectful, or frightening, then they can lead to all sorts of issues which are stemming from development of the brain, essentially. And one of these issues is attachment issues. So when a child has these healthy relationships in those formative years, what you get is that they get these more secure attachment bonds. They find it easier to trust people. They're able to express their needs and to form healthy relationships, as opposed to children who have attachment issues stemming from some sort of neglect in those formative years. And these can come out in a number of ways. So, first of all, you might come across anxious attachment. This is where, they've maybe had inconsistent care in those early years. They have this fear of abandonment that develops, and they have this need for frequent reassurances. Um, but at the same time, they also feel they're not really worthy because, of course, if their attachment needs haven't been met in those early years, then the message that they've been given in those early years is that you're not worthy of attachment. And these are children who struggle to form attachments because they feel that they're not worthy of it. They feel like they're asking too much if they want someone to form an attachment with them. The crunch is, though, there's this need this human need for attachment. And what you often see is that they form a- attachments to a safe person, that one individual that is probably consistently there, is interacts with them on a regular basis, a daily basis, and gives them attention, gives them contact, gives them a bit of security. And they form an attachment bond with this person, a extreme attachment bond with this person. It's like they feel that this person is their safe person who is going to be there for them, who's going to provide for their needs. They're coming from a place where attachment isn't a safe thing because it's not consistent. So the moment they come across someone who seems to be consistent, who seems to show up for them, then they form this really strong attachment, which, if you've not gone through complex trauma, is something that a lot of people just can't understand. It is that vital thing for their existence. And of course, what that means is that that safe person, their their existence depends on not being rejected by that safe person, on continued connections with that safe person. Now, for children, this can be problematic because quite often for children, those safe connections could well be a teacher. So when they're finishing out the year and they're going to move on to another class, suddenly they lose that one safe connection. And that can feel catastrophic for them because if they don't have that safe connection at home, suddenly that there's nothing there. And like I said, it is a human need to have those connections, to have the emotional connections, the interpersonal connections, to have attachment and feel like you do matter for someone. Now, I'm going to come back to this because I think this is something significant in terms of what I'm talking about in this video. But I do need to just go over the other forms of attachment. So you also get avoidant attachment, which is basically where they've come from a situation where caregivers are distant. They're not getting that emotional connection at all. They're distant or they're unresponsive. And what happens is that these children become uncomfortable with becoming close to people. Um, they might minimize their emotional needs and become really heavily independent. These kinds of children aren't as likely to form these trauma attachments that you see with children who have this anxious attachment type. Because for them, instead of having the inconsistency in their interpersonal relationships with their like primary caregivers, it's pretty much been non-existent. So they've had to learn to be self-reliant. And this does actually come into play with what I'm talking about in this video as well. So I will come back to that. Now, the third type that you get is the disorganized attachment. This is one that tends to stem from early trauma and can quite often come out in ways like, intense emotional swings, throwing boots at people, for example, or a real sense of confusion in relationships, a real struggle to know how to manage relationships in a way that's going to allow them to be safe in a relationship and to continue with a relationship. And this is where we get to Lily and Jack and to Maddie, because when I look at both their cases, it occurs to me that in actual fact, these children have suffered different types of trauma, not just from what they experienced from at the hands of their mothers' partners, but even before them. Because I think from what we know about Malaya, from what we know about Jen, that they were bringing their own traumas to the party here. And that what we're seeing here is a classic example of intergenerational trauma that's collided essentially with CPTSD. And I think what we're seeing here is three children who the chances of them suffering this CPTSD at the hands of their mother's partners was actually greatly increased before these people even came on the scene. And that when we start to look at the big picture, it seems there was definitely a far greater risk of these children being put in a traumatic situation because of who their mothers were. So we don't have a lot of details in terms of Malaya's family relationships, but we have enough to know that there were issues between her and Cindy, that for at least some period of time she lived with Paddy, her grandmother. When it comes to Jen Soto, we know that there were issues between her and her mother. So I would actually speculate that in terms of their own development, that Malaya and Jen were probably both in a situation where they had emotionally distant mothers, and where, as a result, both of them developed some level of avoidant attachment. So they could switch off and not offer that attachment that is necessary for young children. When you hear Jen Soto talk about Maddie, it's almost like she's talking about a stray dog that wandered into the house and won't leave. You really don't get a sense of Jen really giving much of a toss about Maddie. You really don't get a sense of there ever having been any sort of strong connection between the two of them. And in fact, it actually seems that as Maddie got older, that Jen saw her as competition for Stephan, because you have that horrible statement that she made where she said that she joked with Stephan that she was afraid that his relationship with Maddie would turn into like a Woody Allen situation and that they'd head off and leave her alone. Jen's ex-husband spoke about the times when Jen would just completely check out and he would have to take responsibility for Maddie and his daughter. He would have to be like doing full care for both girls because Jen just basically checked out and left it up to him to do the parenting. And when you look at it that way, it makes you consider that if Jen is this type of avoidant personality, the not really forming strong attachments, very much just being, you know, in her own world as far as interpersonal relationships, that when it comes to her relationships with men, that I think there was that need to have someone there who can just basically pick up the reins when she completely checks out. Someone who's potentially not going to place heavy demands on her in terms of attachment. And I think, while it would be fair to say that there's clearly some level of disorganized attachment there with Jen, when you look at her trying to put herself in between Tyler and Tatiana when they were engaged and getting pregnant with Maddie. So there's certainly some level of not wanting to let go when she has an attachment. So I do think that Jen has a number of complicated attachment issues. But I think what's crucial here to understand is that she seems to have needed to form an attachment with someone who can basically take up the reins for her when she wants to just completely check out. I think Jen's relationship with her mother has probably created this woman who is like really not so worried about forming strong emotional attachments. It's more about looking after her own needs. And if that means having someone on hand to just pick it all up and, form an attachment with her child so she doesn't have to bother with her child, then that's what she's going to do. And I think that's why, despite the fact that, her and Stephan seem to be broken up more than they were together, it was convenient for her because it allowed her to avoid giving the emotional connections that Maddie needed. It allowed her to check out and just be there for Jen. Now I'm going to come back to Maddie because I want to talk about how her relationships with Jen and Stephan impacted on what was going on, and particularly how her relationship with Jen made it a lot easier for Stephan to do what he did. So, taking a look at Malaya, like I said, it seems that there was not a good relationship between her and her mother, to the extent that she ended up living with Paddy for some period of time. Not only that, though, we know that the relationship between Cindy and Malaya's father ended when she was quite young, by the sounds of it. And there has been a lot of chatter about issues with alcoholism. Not to mention, of course, a bit of a history in terms of a criminal record, including weapons charges. So it would seem that perhaps in those early years, Malaya may have had a less than stable environment in terms of secure attachments and just feeling safe. So I think what we're seeing here, first of all, let's look at Malaya's relationship with her children, because I think her relationship with Lily and Jack and with Meadow certainly points towards some level of attachment, avoidant attachment. We heard from Belinda that after Jack was born, Malaya was kind of focusing quite a lot on Jack and Lily was getting left out. Now, that's not unusual when a new baby comes along. And we could dismiss that as, well, that's just, the new baby came along, so the baby was getting a lot of attention. But then we get Janie talking about how Malaya became obsessed with baby M after she came along, and that Lily and Jack really weren't getting the same sort of attention from Malaya. So it does point towards the possibility that Lily and Jack weren't being given the level of attachment that they needed to have healthy development, essentially. But at the same time, it seems that the environment that Malaya grew up in terms of the relationship between Henry and Cindy and the issues that Henry seems to have appeared to have, the broken family, I strongly suspect that that has led to anxious attachment issues. Basically, this need to be reassured of an attachment, to feel an attachment, to be worrying about abandonment. And this is where things become difficult for Lily and Jack. Not just simply the detachment that appears to have been going on in terms of her favouring Meadow, because I think when you look at it in those terms, if there was a level of emotional detachment between her and Lily and Jack, then she's less likely to act on potential threats to their well-being because there's less attachment there. And because her greater need is for a secure attachment with a safe person. And here's the irony: it seems that Malaya has this need for an attachment, for a safe person, for an attachment, but she's not very good at actually picking who that safe person is. I believe Malaya was an easy target for Daniel because, with her family background, she was looking for that secure attachment, that one person that could be her safe place, and he was there to step into the role. So if you look at the overall picture, you have Malaya living with her grandmother potentially, or living at home when she meets Cody, and then she gets into a relationship with Cody. Now, things went south there, and after that relationship ended, straight away she was looking on Facebook for men to date. She found some other guy that apparently wasn't good enough because he didn't connect with Lily and Jack or something. But then she found Daniel. So after breaking up with Cody, she's had that need to once again find that secure connection, that one person that's a safe connection. And I mean, Daniel moved in within 2 weeks. That to me says that he love bombed the crap out of her. How do you form a secure connection with someone? How do you suddenly make yourself feel that they're the safe person? If they are love bombing the crap out of you, they're making you feel validated. So he stepped in as Malaya's safe person. And then, on top of that, he removed her from her other supports so that the only connections she really had was with her mother and her friend Angeline. We know Malaya's relationship with her mother wasn't great, and I think we could be pretty certain that even though Malaya was allowed to have contact with Angeline, that there were certainly limitations placed on that. So she would have become dependent on Daniel for her emotional needs. He was her safe person. For someone who comes from a trauma background, having that safe person, that person that you feel is going to be there the whole time, is going to be there for your emotional needs, for your attachment needs, is like needing air. You are so afraid that you're going to lose that person because if you lose that person, it's like you suddenly can't breathe. Your ability to breathe has stopped. And this is where, sadly, the whole coercive control side of things comes in, because Malaya needed that secure attachment, that one person that was her safe person. But at the same time, she was also terribly afraid of losing that safe person, which meant that he could be a narcissistic asshole and throw in all the coercive control. And Malaya would be so afraid of losing that attachment, that crucial thing that gave her air, that it would make it almost impossible for her to leave. And of course, the really cruel part of a coercive control relationship is that over time they undermine your sense of self as well. So, this person who became her safe person gradually chipped away at her self esteem to the point where she would have felt that she really wasn't worthy of anyone else, that she was lucky to have him there because he at least stuck by her and gave her the emotional needs, the emotional attachments, the personal attachment that she needed. So there would have been this internal struggle of she wasn't worthy of anyone else and she needed the safety of the connection with someone, and that someone just happened to be her abuser. So I think that if there was that level of emotional detachment from her two older children, because the focus was on the baby, when you put that up alongside the need for the safety of that one person, that one secure attachment, that in her brain, having that secure attachment with Daniel was far more important than the needs of her children because she didn't have the same deep connection with them. I could be wrong, but certainly from everything we've heard, it leads me in that direction. Essentially, we're talking about a level of anxious attachment that has rolled over into a trauma bond. She needed Daniel for the attachment despite the trauma that she was going through. And ultimately, it cost Lily and Jack. And I suspect that the ability to just detach herself emotionally is quite likely the reason why Malaya has pretty much stayed silent for the last 15 months. Because in terms of emotional connections, in terms of attachments, she can go back inside herself and just worry about Malaya as opposed to worry about Lily and Jack. And I think the other thing that we've seen in terms of the need for a secure attachment, a safe person, is that she's gone straight from Daniel to Cheryl. And now Cheryl is her safe connection, the one person that she's just super reliant on in terms of she needs her there or she just feels like she can't breathe. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, for Malaya, the need to have that safe person trumps all else. So when it came to Lily and Jack, she couldn't leave because for her, all her other supports had been removed. She had to have that safe person. And sadly, that safe person just happened to be the same person that was creating all the turmoil in the trauma. So that brings us back to Maddie. Maddie with her mother who was completely ambivalent towards her. Maddie who was pretty much served up to Stephan Sterns. But the thing is, when you listen to Maddie's best friend, when you look at some of the messages that Maddie sent to Stephan, there's this confusing realization that to Maddie, it was almost like she was in a relationship with Stephan. When we look at Maddie's world before Stephan came along, she had a mother who was distant, I'm guessing, well, based on what we've heard from Stephen Young. It certainly sounds like Jenn could be quite emotionally distant towards Maddie at times, but also not consistent. For her to just check out and just let her husband take over looking after her daughter, for her to go through her bipolar bits, that to me suggests that not only was she perhaps not very emotionally available for Maddie, but that Maddie probably went through years of uncertainty, not knowing what was coming next with her relationship with Jenn. So I think what we have is an anxious attachment issue here for Maddie. And it seems that sadly her abuser also took on the role of being her safe person. And I think this is for a number of reasons. It's not just about Jenn being emotionally unavailable, but it's also about essentially being pushed away by Yolanda at, at the times when she was calling out for the help. So, Yolanda, her grandmother, Maddie spent time with her sometimes. She'd stay overnight and Yolanda would get her to school. And in Yolanda's interview, she speaks about a few different incidents. There was one time a year earlier when Maddie had had some sort of massive argument with Jenn and she'd taken off. She'd left the house and she rang her grandmother. That was her reaching out to her grandmother and essentially saying, I want you to be my safe connection. I want you to be my safe person that is there for my emotional needs. And Yolanda said, go back to your mother, stop walking the streets, it's dangerous. And again, on the Saturday before Maddie's birthday party, Maddie had been staying with Yolanda through the week because Jenn was doing training. And on the Saturday, Maddie was meant to go home and she got really, really distraught, really upset. So Yolanda arranged for her to spend some time with her grandfather. And he took her for burgers, spent a bit of time with her. But ultimately, Maddie still got sent home Sunday night, despite not wanting to go home. And we know that she was having a bit of an anxiety attack at her birthday party. She was telling her friends she was upset because she didn't get enough presents. But I suspected that was more of an excuse for perhaps panic over Stephan arriving. But it certainly seems like Yolanda, Juan, the extended members of Maddie's family, it seems like she made that attempt to make that connection, to make them her safe people, to create a new safe person, essentially, away from Stephan, and they pushed her away. Now, they wouldn't wouldn't have been doing that intentionally. It was more a case of, well, no, you got to go sort out your problems with your mother, not realizing that below this, I don't want to go home or I've had a fight with my mother, was this cry for someone to become a support person, someone to step into the role of her safe person, the person who could be consistently there to listen to her needs, just to acknowledge when she was stressed, when she was anxious. So who did that leave? Stephan. Essentially, he became her safe person because nobody else tried. So we have her sending him this message with a picture of these Amazon parenting coins saying, we should get these. We have her best friend saying, oh, she was talking to him on the phone all the time. She formed a trauma attachment with him because he was the only person giving her attention. I believe that Maddie grew up with a mother who was emotionally distant and probably inconsistent when you look at her issues with bipolar. So Maddie had complex PTSD, in my opinion, even before Stephan came along. And she had this desperate need for a safe person, someone who was going to notice her, someone who was going to be attentive to her, someone who was going to be there for her every day. And sadly, Stephan stepped up to the mark. Maddie couldn't talk about what she was going through with anyone because her safe person was the person who was putting her through it. And no one else was ready to step up to the mark and become her safe person. And of course, the other side of that is that whole fear of abandonment. If you feel that there is that one person in the world that is the safe person, the person you can go to when your whole world is crumbling, you're going to be terrified of losing that person because it would be a feeling that your whole world has ended. You would have this fear that you wouldn't be able to function if this person abandoned you because there is no one else to give you that safety, that support. So Maddie would not have wanted to betray Stephan by telling anyone about what was happening because beneath all the horror that she was going through would have been that fear of abandonment. If she spoke about what he was doing, he would abandon her and there wouldn't be that safe person there, the person that she could tell anything to, the person that she could send a message to any time that would respond. And of course, when it comes to someone with this sort of anxious attachment, the problem is that outside of that one safe person, they feel like they're not worthy. They feel like they can't burden other people with their concerns, their worries. They might test them out like Maddie was doing with Yolanda, ringing her and saying, I've had a fight with Jenn and I'm now, walking around the neighbourhood. And if they basically deflect and go, well, go back home and sort it out. Now, I'm making it a bit more blunt than what Yolanda was. But if they've tested out another person trying to see if that person can become their safe person, and they realize that that person is not going to be their safe person, they're going to feel rejected. Even though that's not the intention, they're going to feel that they're not worthy of attachments. And so, this one person that is offering them this position as their safe person, their safe attachment, they're going to be so afraid of losing that because they're going to think they're not going to find that again. And of course, because of their issues with forming secure attachments, the thought of losing that one safe attachment would be like feeling like you were going to just stop existing because you'd be feeling like you were losing the one thing that made you feel worthwhile. Now, when you bear in mind this need for this one safe attachment, this one safe person, when we look at Malaya, when we look at Maddie, who were both going through traumas, were isolated in that the only safe person they had was the person who was putting them through these things. There's one more factor that essentially makes them feel that they're not going to get another safe person, that they're not worthy of someone else forming an attachment with them. And that's what is called a shame wound. Now, I am actually going to play one clip, and this is from an account on TikTok because if you are interested in learning more about complex trauma, about PTSD, all these sorts of things, about attachments, then this account is by far one of the best ones I've come across. She explains things really well. She's a clinical psychiatrist, I believe. Like, she's a professional. So she knows what she's talking about. But I think her explanation of a shame wound will help us understand a little bit of why Malaya probably felt trapped with Daniel and why Maddie felt that she couldn't confide in anyone else with regards to what she was going through and why she didn't tell anyone what she was going through because obviously she wasn't going to talk about it with Stephan, off limits. But it is certainly something that is worth understanding too in terms of anyone with complex PTSD. Because when you've gone through childhood trauma, this is something that a lot of people with childhood trauma experience. And this is something that can have a huge impact on their relationships later in life, or simply have a huge impact on how they cope with traumatic situations as a child. So I'll just play this clip for you.
A shame wound is at the core of complex trauma and childhood developmental trauma. A shame wound tells you that you are not good, you are bad. There is something fundamentally wrong with you as a person. There is something bad about you. And as a child, if you've experienced physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, any sort of abuse, it is a message that your parents or the perpetrator says to you that you are bad. And you internalize this into your psyche, into your schemas, into your belief system.
Now, there is more to that clip, but I just wanted to play that part because I think the explanation of when you've gone through that sort of trauma and it gives that idea that you are a bad person, that you have this shame that you don't want people to see. And that can be very isolating. So you're certainly not going to turn around and tell people about the experience that caused that wound. And while this is in the context of childhood trauma, at the same time, when you are looking at adults that go through ongoing trauma, adults in relationships that have, DV, coercive control, again, it's that same thing, the shame wound. They feel that what they've gone through makes them a bad person, makes them not worthwhile. So they're not going to want to confide in people about that. So they're going to have this belief that nobody else could possibly accept them, which leaves them trapped, leaves them in a situation where they feel that even though their safe person is also their abuser, there's that belief that they're a bad person. Nobody else could possibly want to love them or want to form a connection with them. And the thought of having no connection is catastrophic for them. The thought of losing the safe connection and not finding another safe connection feels catastrophic, and they get trapped in the situation they're in. Maddie's attempts to reach out to Yolanda for help when she was experiencing a form of crisis. Now, to Yolanda, that was just her doing the "this is between you and your mother, I'm not going to intervene." But to Maddie, coming from that trauma background, it was a rejection. It was confirmation of the fact that she was not worthy, that she was a bad person. Confirmation that there wasn't someone else who could be a safe person for her. So, with that happening, it meant that there was no one that she could reach out to about what was happening with Stephan because he made himself her safe person and the people around her allowed that to happen because they did not understand the psychological needs that she had and w- what appeared to them as them setting boundaries to her was rejection and confirmation that she was a bad person. Then when you look at Malaya's situation, this coercive control DV situation, what's going on there is that even though Daniel made himself her safe person by isolating her from everybody else, at the same time he was on a daily basis reinforcing this shame wound that she was not worthy, that she was a failure, she was a bad parent, amongst other things. Who knows what else he was putting into her mind to undermine her. So again, for Malaya, it would have been a situation where there was this fear of rejection, a fear of abandonment, and a fear that if she left that situation, that she was not worthy of someone else becoming her safe person, of someone else actually becoming an attachment for her. And of course, this also explains her getting into a relationship almost straight away after she left Daniel, because she needed someone to fill that role as a safe person. But you can see where I'm coming from with this. Now, I don't for one moment excuse Malaya. She, even after leaving Daniel, did not come forward for her children. Even after her children were deceased, she still put forward the same narrative that Daniel and Janie were putting forward. She was part of that whole narrative. She was part of the cover up. She's continued to stay silent. She put out that statement for Please Bring Me Home, which, when I read that, certainly once again sounded like someone trying to pretend they had nothing to do with it, trying to act like they knew nothing. But not only that, she had that opportunity, we are told, about a month earlier, to leave. She was offered a lifeline, but she was so desperate to keep that attachment that despite having seen the bruises on her children, despite having had visits from CPS, she made the choice to stay. And that choice cost her children their lives. I've said for quite some time, yes, Malaya was a victim in her relationship with Daniel. But when it comes to Lily and Jack, I don't believe that she could be claiming to be a victim. She made choices prior to when they went missing and after they went missing, which to me says that she is not a victim in the situation when it comes to the loss of her children. But at the same time, I also have to recognise the trauma issues there, the attachment issues, that certainly made it harder for her to do the right thing. As for Jenn Soto, well, I got nothing. She had nothing for Maddie. There's nothing there where I can turn around and say it's because of some emotional issue that all this happened with Maddie. Because at the end of the day, Jenn Soto was emotionally unavailable for her daughter. She did not provide her daughter the attachments that she needed. She had this need for an attachment, not for a safety sort of thing, but to provide for her needs, to basically do the adulting for her. Yes, I think that to some extent, Stephan probably did act as her safe person in terms of someone that she could talk to about her mother, and that's probably some element of it. But it seems to me that the main thing for Jenn was about looking after Jenn. And I suspect that she's probably the sort of person that can take it or leave it when it comes to any sort of attachment. To me, Jenn created a situation where her daughter was caught in a attachment situation with the person who was hurting her the most. And this is a young girl who wasn't even a teenager at that point in time when all this was happening, who didn't even have the tools that you develop as you head into adulthood for coping with situations like that, who probably wouldn't have even had the understanding of what was going on with this relationship that she thought she had with Stephan. But at the end of the day, we have three children who were being touted as neurodivergent: autism for Maddie, ASD for Lily and Jack, who were almost certainly suffering from CPTSD, but who were also the victims of their own parents' traumas. This is an intergenerational thing. It's not as visible as the child who sees his father hitting his mother and grows up to do the same with his partner, but it's there. It's the emotional neglect that occurs in childhood that leads to the choice of the wrong partners or emotional distance from the children, which puts them in harm's way. And while I think that as a society we are definitely getting better at acknowledging childhood traumas, at being open about childhood traumas and removing the stigmas, but I think too that there's a bit of a normalization within society of it being okay to be selfish, that it's too much of a burden to take the time to just maybe listen to someone who's struggling with trauma because you've got your own issues and it's too much of a burden. So that you have people who have been taught due to childhood experiences that they're not worthwhile, that they're not someone that is worthy of connections. People whose self worth is so low that when the wrong sort of person offers them that safety connection, they jump at it and they believe that it's something they can't afford to lose because there's no one else out there that's going to take up that role if they get rejected or if they walk away from it. And I think that when I look at these three children in front of me on the screen, it makes me think that we could all learn to show a bit more empathy towards others, to try and show up more often for others when they maybe just need someone to listen to, someone to send them a message and say, "Are you okay?" Just to find ways to show people that they're not too much, that they are worthwhile, so that just maybe they can feel that they're worth more than how they see themselves, which may potentially give them the ability to avoid or get out of these sorts of dangerous relationships. Now, obviously, there's always additional factors like coercive control, etc. But I do think that society has become this place where people don't see other people anymore, where people don't make themselves available for people who need support. And it seems that far too often it's the children that pay the price.